Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Julia Neshwat, and I'm a fellow at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center, and I'll be moderating today's session and discussion on energy, resilience, and national security challenges in the Arctic region. This event is on the record. We are live streaming to Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, so we encourage you to post about today's discussion and feel free to share on social media using the hashtag AC Energy, as well as tagging us at AC Global Energy if you can. And those who are participating by Zoom, you can submit questions in the Q&A portal, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen anytime during the session, and we'll certainly try to get to as many of those questions as we can. So with that, again, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here today. Let me start with, as many of you may know, we have this changing climate, of course, and the Arctic is among the fastest warming regions in the world. As a result, we have new shipping routes, illegal fishing activities, nuclear submarines hiding in places that are emerging as the region becomes more accessible for a longer period throughout the year. In addition, you see increased access to untapped oil and gas and critical mineral reserves. All of this estimated to about $1 trillion worth. And then, of course, combine that with a longer extraction season, all sure to certainly heighten tensions in countries that seek to really try to capitalize on some of these opportunities. I was just saying earlier, just this past Friday, you had a joint statement released by President Xi Jinping as well as President Putin, making a lot of references to the Arctic. So there's no doubt you're seeing even non-Arctic nations, if you will, such as China, committed to a bigger future in the Arctic, and you're seeing a lot of influence that is currently expanding. And even here in the United States, we're seeing a lot of leadership talking about more physical presence in the Arctic, both military and civilian, and having the infrastructure to really support that presence. And of course, without presence, diplomacy and cooperation can be absent. So with that, I am really thrilled to have the ambassador of Iceland to the United States, Ambassador Birgis Elistotis. Forgive me if I did not say that exact. She's held many key positions, perm rep to the United Nations, many key roles with NATO, EU, and EFTA, and we're just really delighted. I know you were just getting off a plane coming back from Iceland, so thank you for being here with us to join us to provide keynote remarks. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia, and for the kind words and introduction. And I just want to say how honored I am to provide some general opening remarks at this important and timely event. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing the experts outline their thoughts and knowledge on a wide range of energy-related issues in the Arctic. The topic of discussion is very much at the center of Iceland's foreign policy, as well as our local political environment in which climate change, energy transformation, and security in the high north are among key priorities. The themes at hand are all interlinked, and it is worth stating, if anyone should think we're mixing too many ingredients into this one conversation, that building resilience to better adapt to the region's shared challenges calls for a collective action and cross-disciplinary approach. As Ambassador for Iceland in the United States, I'm very proud to be able to point out our recent chairmanship of, in our view, the key institution or body in this arena, the Arctic Council. And it was not an easy task, keeping in mind how these last few years have been affected by both COVID and political tensions between the global powers. And in that light, we are satisfied with what we were able to accomplish during our 2-year chairmanships of the Arctic Council, but also grateful for the spirit of cooperation we were able to rely on in our endeavors. And you may recall, some of you, that we handed over the gavel to the incoming chairmanship in May of last year at the Reykjavik ministerial meeting. And Russia, being the Arctic state that took over the responsibility of chairing this vital body for 2 years. Now, it goes without saying that given the current events in Europe and tensions between the United States, NATO, and Russia, some questions have arisen as to what effect all of that may have on the activities of the Arctic Council. And on that topic, I can only state our hope and wish that we may continue to keep the Arctic Council as a conflict-free body. The fundamental changes taking place in the Arctic will not take into consideration at all whether the relationship between Russia and the West is good or not at any given point in time. The current situation perhaps shows better than anything how delicate the interplay is between environmental development in the Arctic, political tensions, and the security of our hemisphere as a whole. And caught in between are the people of the Arctic, both indigenous and others, and the wildlife on land as well as marine life at sea. And it is up to us all to manage this responsibly. As we all know, and you mentioned, Julia, climate change and the rapid Arctic warming in particular is very alarming. Nowhere else can the impact be felt, seen, and experienced as demonstrably. And this will not change unless we find sustainable solutions to slow down the current pace of change and the wide-ranging effects of melting glaciers, freshwater inflow, and ocean acidification as also reach far beyond the Arctic. Effective mitigation and adaptation strategies that strike a balance between environmental protection, social inclusion, and economic growth are key for building resilience and for sustainable development of the Arctic region, where challenges are often exaggerated by energy insecurity and lack of natural resources, especially in remote Arctic communities. The environmental impact of climate change in the Arctic has, however, also brought certain opportunities. You mentioned the transpolar shipping routes, easier access to natural resources, and therefore the potential for increased opportunities in clean energy and economic activities for the people of the Arctic, which is important. The people of the Arctic count 4 million. But here we must also tread carefully. In Iceland, we believe in safeguarding the rule-based international order, in strong regional cooperation, and in the urgency of the task mankind is faced with in light of the climate crisis. But we also firmly believe in the sustainable utilization of natural resources, and sustainable being the key word. We in Iceland are blessed that one of the natural resources we can rely on is renewable energy, and that is clearly something that has helped us realize the extent to which green energy solutions are key to fighting climate change. And this is an area we want to devote ourselves and where we believe we have an experience to share, both because we want to do our part in the battle ahead, the challenge of meeting requirements and reducing emissions to fight climate change, but also because it presents an opportunity to us, to our entrepreneurs and companies, who we know have been finding receptive audience here in the US to some of the innovative solutions they have developed. And this is especially true in the area of carbon capture and storage. But we are, of course, very much aware of some of the risks and the dangers that lurk beyond the horizon. Some of those will be discussed by our distinguished panel, those that result in part from the changes taking place, the Arctic becoming more accessible, increasing shipping traffic through the high north from Asia to Europe and America. And we must be vigilant if we want to address illegal fishing activities, curtail as much as possible military movements in the Arctic that could bring the region into conflict. And I'm sure I do not have to tell you how dangerous it is for a nation that relies to a great extent on exporting fish and fish products if only one accident took place north of us resulting in an oil spill. And Julia, you also mentioned nuclear submarines. And speaking of fisheries, I just wanted to mention that the important milestone, the agreement to prevent unregulated high seas fisheries in the Central Arctic Ocean presents, which entered into force last year. And we think this is an example of a forward-looking approach, which can serve as an example in other areas. That is to protect an area from commercial fishing even before such fishing has begun. But as mentioned, any race toward militarization of the Arctic could present an existential threat to our well-being. Indeed, even just increased traffic presents a challenge. Just as an example, the greatly increased tourism on huge cruise ships in the Arctic is certainly a worry. But with that being said, and these general remarks at the outset of this, I'm very much looking forward to listening to the upcoming discussion. And I hand it over to you again, Julia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for that insightful overview. Again, a lot to think about as we move into the session and our questions. But let me go ahead now and turn it to our virtual panel. It is my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. We have Major General Randy Church-Key. He is the Senior Advisor to the Arctic Security Affairs Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies with the Department of Defense. Is fairly new, so I commend him in trying to start a new entity, putting that all together. That certainly takes quite a bit of creativity and perseverance. But Church and I actually were also commissioners to the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, and he was also used to be the executive director of the Arctic Domain Awareness Center as well in Alaska. So thrilled to have him here with us today. We also have Michael McElhenney, apologies, Michael, Senior Advisor to the Arctic Energy Office at the U.S. Department of Energy. Again, thrilled to have you here, Michael. Michael was part of creating the Arctic Energy Office, which is tremendous, and had served also for the Undersecretary of the Navy. So he's got a amazing, tremendous background as well today. And then finally, we have Terza Tippin-Poe. She's a U.S. Arctic Inupiat, as well as principal consultant with ICS Trio Global. So has a great background and experience in the oil and gas sector and working with the private sector and other companies. So we're so pleased to have all of you here with us today to share your perspectives on such an important topic. Let me just quickly say again to the audience as a reminder, please feel free to place your questions for the panelists in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll hopefully get to that towards the end of the session. So with that, I'd like to start with a little bit of a broad opening here. The Arctic, again, it's a growing complex ecosystem, both environmentally and geopolitically. So in each of your perspectives, I want to just kind of open it up to everyone first. If you could share a little bit about what you think are some of the major points of tension when it comes to energy, geopolitics, security, even the transition of the region at this point in time. So maybe we'll start with General Church-Key, if you can begin with your remarks. Thank you.
Julia, thank you very much. Madam Ambassador, Julia, Michael, and Terza, distinguished colleagues, it's a privilege to be on this webinar with you all today. I'm coming into you from Joint Base Elmendorf Richardson in outside of Anchorage, Alaska, where I have the privilege of standing up the DoD's first new regional center in more than 20 years, and one oriented on the Arctic region. The Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies was enacted into law first with an opportunity for the Secretary of Defense to consider establishing a center in 2021. Last June, the Secretary decided after a period of analysis to go forth and to establish this center. We are underway. We're established now formally as DoD's 6th regional center through the National Defense Authorization Act in December 27, 2021. As an enduring center, taking our place alongside the 5 established centers that really are aligned to the respective overseas theaters. one in Europe, three that are located in Washington, D.C., and one located in Hawaii, and now us being number 6, being located in Alaska, focused on not only Alaska, but really a pan-Arctic perspective. In these early days for our center, it's crazy when you try to put something like this new together. We're anticipating we somewhere in the neighborhood of between 30, 35 folks as a starting point, getting our feet established. And then ultimately we're focused on 3 principal areas: executive education, that of research analysis, and engagement and outreach as one of the important tools of soft power in DoD's kit bag to establish and work its Arctic priorities in concert with the national strategies and really the national defense strategy. The reflection I give you, though, however, are really mine alone, and they don't necessarily represent the views of organizations which I'm assigned or affiliated. Among my experience with the Arctic, I'll share you that I've spent time listening and learning from the Arctic and specifically Alaska's indigenous communities, and getting insights from people who have been a part of the Arctic really since time began. The Arctic is exceptional. Arctic exceptionalism in the size, breadth, and depth of ongoing collaboration, Arctic science, economic endeavors, indigenous people's concerns, military cooperation, and governance-related activities are really the envy of many across the globe. Perhaps I'm an Arctic optimist. However, continued Arctic exceptionalism is by no means assured. And U.S. investments in Arctic initiatives of science, economics, and measures to ensure our national sovereignty and security should rather be top priorities among our national interest. The opportunity of the Arctic, though, is articulated here, is in a sense is opening as a result of a region that's warming at not just 2 times the rate of lower latitudes, really more than 3 to 4 times, depending on which status you're looking at right now. Meaning that it provides an incentive because the access barrier is much lower, and ultimately for both Arctic and Arctic nations alike to pursue this easier access to extract minerals, harvest marine life, conduct maritime transportation, advance tourism, and of course project sovereign influence. The diminishing Arctic ice environment is enabling rising competition between national powers. The Russian Federation has refurbished a number of former Soviet Arctic bases, built a number more, and is capable of projecting power to and through the Arctic. With a dominant number of icebreakers, Russia can project surface forces in multiple directions simultaneously and around across the region. As many of us probably well appreciate, Russian national decision-making and defense planning are definitely opaque at best. And Russia's military advantage should be met with resolve and strength, as America cannot afford to be perceived as weak in our Arctic commitment to the Kremlin. It's important to note, though, that Russia is an Arctic nation who shares a critical Arctic waterway with the United States. It is in the nation's both interest, both the United States and the Russian Federation, to prevent conflict, for example, in the Bering and Chukchi Seas. Conversely, though, the People's Republic of China advanced influence through its economic power to gain access across the Arctic. China is normalizing an Arctic presence via nationally owned icebreakers, gaining port access, and advancing mining interests. It is not inconceivable that China may conduct extractive measures closer to the U.S. Arctic Maritime EEZ than we would likely prefer, particularly based on China's track record of environmental stewardship elsewhere. It is in our interest, I frankly believe, to find ways to decouple joint approaches between Moscow and Beijing in the Arctic region. This is possible through diplomatic approach that does not condone or reward Russian malign actions. But they're certainly guided by the realization that closer relationships between Beijing and Moscow in the Arctic region is perhaps not in our national interest. In any case, however, I do not believe that strategic competition among great powers in the Arctic region needs to become great power confrontation. And ultimately, just from the backdrop of the most difficult operational and geostrategically challenging areas on the planet, I would like just to make a brief comment of those folks that are in the business of trying to provide the hand of help across the region. Ultimately, this is a difficult place to operate. As a career military pilot with 30 years of service that includes operating the Arctic, please let me assure folks that are on the call wondering how does America's military respond in the region. In the hand of help mission, what America's military does to include specifically the U.S. Coast Guard in search and rescue, humanitarian assistance, and disaster response is demanding, requires daunting courage and expert skills and really a matchless fidelity to duty. One point to emphasize that as increased capabilities are being developed and projected in the Arctic region, I take a look at specific areas of regional concern, for example, the Bering Straits, which could become a maritime choke point that may at some point in the future become as important as the Straits of Malacca or the Panama Canal. In any case, I do believe that our interest across the Arctic region, it requires us to increase our understanding and awareness, and ultimately the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies is going to be one of those tools that help advance that for the Department of Defense, and ultimately Department of Defense as it engages with the interagency, internationally, and domestically. So that's just a brief recap or a thought of reflections. I thought I would start with that and maybe help seed the conversation that we're going to have. Julia, I give the floor back to you.
Thank you so much, Church. Really appreciate that. Let me turn to Michael next on some of his thoughts about the region as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Church. I'd also like to preface with my views are my own and not those necessarily of anybody in the U.S. government or its agencies. I also want to strongly associate myself with everything Church said. I'm in violent agreement with him, so I will speak much less. Everything he said is absolutely correct. And from our perspective at DOE, we have reestablished the Arctic Energy Office in part because of the changing Arctic and the importance of the Arctic, as Church mentioned. You asked, Julia, what has changed? So I'll get kind of narrow it down. One of our Arctic partners has gone all in on extraction of oil and gas and has bet their country's economy and its future on the Arctic and transforming it to meet their economic and political needs. I'm talking, of course, about the Russian Federation. And we among the Arctic states are responding to that a little bit belatedly, but wholeheartedly across the government in a whole of government effort. Whereas perhaps after the end of the Cold War, perhaps the Arctic was the whole in government. So we are moving ahead, and Congress directed the reestablishment of the Arctic Energy Office in Fairbanks, Alaska, to help bring the Department of Energy right into the region to support these whole of government and pan-Arctic efforts to ensure that the region is managed by, for, and with the interests of the Arctic states and Arctic peoples in hand. Our Arctic Energy Office, just give a brief plug, it has 3 missions: energy, security, and science. On the energy side, it's not just about making sure that energy is available to the residents of the Arctic and to the states of the Arctic, but to make sure that communities in the Arctic, including Alaska, mitigate some of the impacts both of energy development, but also of the extremely high energy costs for domestic transportation and business that they face. For security, of course, national security, which we mentioned, and then environmental security. The changing Arctic threatens over the long term the lives and livelihood of the peoples of the Arctic in many different ways, as the ambassador and Church mentioned. We're working again across the whole of government to bring the technology and the resources of DOE and its lab system, and encourage other government agencies to participate in making sure that Arctic communities and Arctic institutions can respond to the threats, the security threats they face, both natural and man-made. And then science. The changing Arctic is a challenge to science. We don't know what's happening because the planet's never warmed up like this before, or never changed like this before, and certainly not in the era of computers and modern data management. So facilitating Arctic science, whether it's making use of our computing systems like we have at NREL or at Sandia National Laboratories, whether it's using our science research stations at ARM in Alaska or Licktock Point in Northern Alaska, or coordinating Arctic science across our Arctic partners in the region. We're very committed to that. So again, in short, there is a whole of government effort to respond to the challenges in the Arctic, but we would be fooling ourselves if we didn't realize that it is in part due to the actions of one Arctic state that are transforming the region. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael. And finally, last but not least, Tirza.
Thank you, Julia, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for having me on the panel today. And also, thanks to Michael and Church for setting it up so nicely, and to the ambassador for doing just a phenomenal job, I have to say, of an overview of many of the things that we're thinking about, especially as Arctic peoples. And she did emphasize that it is the people of the Arctic that have a lot to offer the world, both in terms of how we deal with a changing Arctic, but also exporting our knowledge and innovation and the way of being to other people in need. We've been experiencing climate change for decades in the Arctic. It's been observed for as long as I've been alive, frankly. So those discussions have been ongoing. It's just recently that the Western world has once again discovered a new region and is determined to extract from that region, whether it's knowledge or oil and gas or minerals, and commodify that. But before I proceed, just a couple words. So you can tell already that my focus in my work is at the intersection of energy, environment, and communities, especially in the Arctic. And that experience comes from a lived experience. I'm an Indigenous person and it deeply informs both my professional and academic work. My family is from the US Arctic and my home village is Utqiagvik, the Inupiat Village formerly known as Barrow. Now this is a community, for those of you who don't know, I think all on the panel do, it's a community with less than 5,000 people. And we still today in 2022 derive 50% of our food supply from the Arctic Ocean, because the Arctic is an ocean surrounded by land. And my family's been doing business in Alaska for thousands of years in an environment that would kill most people in 12 hours. So I think we have a couple things that we know about sustainability. I know when I started my academic career teaching at Harvard, one of my first speeches, I said much the same opening, I'll be honest, and to many in the room's shock, I said, I think we probably know a little bit more about sustainability than Harvard University. Now, with that bold statement, for the last 7 years, I've been trying to prove it. During my childhood, our subsistence hunting communities were rapidly transformed by intense extractive resource development. And in just one generation, my generation, I personally witnessed the environmental degradation, social upheaval, and land use conflicts of the corporate colonization of my homeland. So it is somewhat ironic that I find myself end up working for large multinational, or what I call now ex-national, resource development corporations like TransCanada Pipelines and later Royal Dutch Shell, advising on new country entries not only in the Arctic, but in Colombia, Iraq, Greenland, and many other locations around the world. Now, that gave me an opportunity to understand how the industry thinks about a region of interest, as we would call it, and frankly, put me at the pointy end of the harpoon in those discussions, especially when we were talking about where I came from, the Arctic. I'll press ahead because I know time is limited. I will say this, back to the point that the ambassador made, I want to reiterate what's at stake here is for outside interests. It is, as Guggenheim Partners has estimated, over $1 trillion in investment at stake in the Arctic, just in the next 10 to 15 years. That includes shipping by 2030, over 5% of the total global trade. Energy, so oil production could double depending on price, as we all know, that's quite volatile, but there are 90 billion barrels of oil there, or oil equivalent, BOE, just waiting to be, as we say, discovered and explored and developed. The ocean resources, we talked briefly about fisheries, but the fishery catches, legal alone, could increase by 70% over the next 40 years. And environmental research, the UFOs arriving with the hordes of environmental researchers. I would say this in closing, one of the most important things we need to remember is that the people who know the Arctic are the people who are most deeply impacted by these changes. They are the people who live in the Arctic. And so it is us on the outside, and I use the general us, that have the solutions to learn from people like my people and the rest of our collective 4 million Arctic peoples, Indigenous and otherwise, as the ambassador rightly pointed out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terza, for that insightful summary there. In fact, it's a great transition because my next question and maybe we'll start with Michael and then back to you, Terza, is as we look at the oil and gas sector, for example, the U.S. Geological Survey has estimated, as you noted, that in the Arctic, it holds over 90 billion barrels of oil and over 1,600 trillion cubic feet of gas. A majority of that is commercially viable. So when we think about the prevalence of needed critical minerals in the Arctic, how does that shape, you think, U.S. policy? And is there what role would you say would resource competition play in the region when it comes to those policies and cooperation overall?
Thank you, Julia. Critical minerals in the Arctic are really a growing topic of interest to the U.S. government and to stakeholders and our allies and partners. The clean energy transition, which is ongoing, absolutely requires vast amounts of critical minerals, far more than are currently being extracted and processed in the United States or in any of its or in most of its allies. Alaska and other parts of the North American Arctic are blessed with large deposits. The question is, can they be safely developed, extracted, and processed in a way that is respectful of indigenous concerns and values and doesn't affect hunting, fishing, and traditional livelihoods? These are all open questions that we're looking at, but and consulting about quite widely across the government. My colleagues in other agencies are probably jumping up and down right now. They are consulting, they are talking. But yes, I think in my personal view, the Arctic will be a key source of the materials needed to maintain the clean energy transition and to maintain the economic performance of the United States and its allies. Currently, those minerals are being extracted and processed in countries that are not very friendly to the United States and not very environmentally friendly to their own peoples or to the rest of the world.
Terza?
Yes. Thank you for those remarks, Michael. You're right. There's a lot at stake here. There's a lot of oil and gas in the Arctic Ocean. And I think I'll go back to the very insightful opening remark of the ambassador from Iceland. Resilience calls for collective action. Now, what does that mean? Well, again, the indigenous people and other Arctic peoples who have been there for a very long time have a whole body of work and approaches to working collectively and in cooperation across national borders. And if I might interpret the ambassador's remarks, that means reaching across borders. And that the way that we get there is by modeling what in Arctic peoples and indigenous people of the Arctic have been doing for millennia, which is this idea of working in a collaborative way. So when we say collective action, what does that mean for, say, oil development? It means collaborative development. It doesn't mean consultation. Consultation, it has morphed into consent and is now morphing again as we think about the communities most deeply impacted by development of the Arctic. It is now a collaborative environment where the knowledge of the people of the region is as valuable or more so than our assumed Western science. If you want to know about ice, you need to go to the Arctic and ask the Arctic ice researchers, many of whom live just outside of Utqiagvik, around the area of Narl, a former military area where my father worked on the dew line. So the people who know the solutions or can offer guidance to how we develop responsibly the resources of the Arctic are really the people who live there. So they're setting the table that all the rest of the world needs to come to. If we're to have any kind of sustainable agreement, I think we saw movement in that way. Just a concrete example, when in administration before last in DC, set up a Bering Straits Resilience Committee that had representation from the most deeply impacted communities along the Arctic coast and subarctic coast, just below the Arctic line, to help advise DC, so the US government, on how safe development might look. And this was groundbreaking. Unfortunately, one of the first acts of the last administration in the United States, not the current one, the one before this one, was to immediately eliminate this community-based advisory board. I bring that example up because that's exactly the kind of partnering with the people of the region that's going to lead to responsible development. The people best able to protect a resource, I think I said in the beginning, are the people who rely upon it for their food security. This is a human security issue, and the people of the region take it very seriously. So I think there's all the opportunity in the world for some significant collaboration with the experts, and those are the people who live in the Arctic.
Thank you, Terza, very much. In fact, you mentioned food security, so I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about the Arctic fisheries that certainly offer, such a growing source of wealth for the Arctic nations. In fact, I think the annual catch value is estimated over $500 million, and certainly, of course, another incentive for non-Arctic states to encroach in the region. So maybe I can go to Church for some initial comment about how you think this is impacting the region with the fisheries.
Oh, well, thank you. First of all, I'd like to compliment Michael and Terza for their really remarkable set of reflections into the last question. When you look at the fisheries management challenges of the Arctic region, it's a direct impact by warming trends. What used to be a fisheries management problem in the Atlantic region between the United Kingdom and Norway is now more of a fisheries management challenge between Norway and the Russian Federation, simply as a result of more fish stocks moving north and east, from the north to Norwegian to the Barents Sea. The same aspect, if you look at the Bering region, the Bering Sea region, where principally much of the fish stocks, Pacific cod and the large whitefish populations were principally located more in the southern Bering. Now, as a result, over the last several years, it's been quite fast how fast the fish have moved north. And you go to, it's now been more of a fisheries management problem to the northern Bering. And historically, there's been a cold pool of water that essentially served as a stopper from fish stocks moving past the Bering Straits and the Chukchi. And that cold pool is diminishing quite remarkably. And ultimately, there's, many are estimating, since the flow of water in the Bering region is moving to the north, from the south to the north, it's only a matter of time before fish stocks start migrating through the straits and into the Chukchi Sea. So again, the fisheries management challenge is the fact is historically where you have fish stocks located, so too you have fisheries enforcement. And now the fish stocks are proving more mobile, and they're moving areas where you don't have essentially the patrolling assets for ensuring fisheries management located. You need to now take a look at the fact that there is now fish stocks. If you're going to manage the fisheries, you're going to look for repositioning where your assets are located to ensure that fisheries management is done properly. I would argue that there's the protein wars, essentially, of marine proteins that are out there. Frankly, that there's many nations that are interested in trying to do sustainable fisheries, but there's also a small number of nations that are not necessarily applying to those same principles of sustainability of fisheries. I look at the challenge that in the Bering Sea, for example, if the United States and the Russian Federation have reached an agreement, more or less, into the fisheries management, but other nations operate in that region, they may not be applying by the same construct. And if you don't have the assets to enforce, then ultimately you can have unsustainable harvest being taken. So from my vantage point, when you look to the north, you take a look at the fact that fish stocks are going to continue to migrate into the further reaches of the north, and where we have a moratorium right now in the Central Arctic Basin, because frankly, there's not a lot of fish there to harvest. There are marine proteins to be harvested, but thus fish stocks per se are not there in numbers yet. But frankly, as warming continues, and the trajectory continues to hold true, that this is going to be a fisheries management challenge. It's going to put pressure on whether or not you continue to sustain the Central Arctic fishing ban. And ultimately, as more fish stocks move there, there's going to be pressure to lift the ban or find some way to get a quota established. So it's not easy. We need more assets. We need more adherence to fisheries management practices and sustainability has got to drive all the nation's approach to again provide the region, the people live there, an opportunity to get that fresh proteins. Frankly, if they can't get to it themselves, they can't sustain their livelihoods, and that's a big deal. So give it back to you. Thank you for the chance to make a brief comment. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you, Church. That was very informative and helpful. Let me, as we move on to energy, let me just hit, I know, Michael, you mentioned this earlier about clean energy. Just real quickly, are you seeing any opportunities? I know NREL has been out there looking at renewables, the possibility, you know, whether it's solar or geothermal. Is there any current status you could provide with regards to any type of clean energy deployment in the Arctic region?
Big announcements may be coming. I don't want to get ahead of anything, but I would say in a very, very civil servant way that the infrastructure bill provides the opportunity for many communities in the United States Arctic to benefit moving forward. So in renewable energy, we are working very closely with our Office of Indian Energy and with other offices to make sure that renewable energy deployment in the Arctic is moving ahead. And I would mention, you know, there have been, it's not just about deploying the infrastructure, as challenging as it is. It's also about the training to make sure that it can be repaired, especially during winter. You know, you can't wait 6 months for a part or 3 months for somebody to come back from the south to come in. So it's about training, working to put those training measures in place. And then it's also about, of course, capital to sustain it and making sure that the money is there to maintain operations. So, all of those things have to be in place. I hope we can announce stuff soon, but there will be opportunities. Renewable energy deployment in the Arctic has never looked better, though. And again, whether it's wind or solar or geothermal, all of those are many projects like that are in the works. I wish I could share some. I can't, but it is. A lot of people used to say, "Oh, you can't do solar in the Arctic." Well, that's nonsense. Kotzebue has a wonderful solar farm. You can't do wind. Of course you can. You can't do geothermal because it's too hard. All of those things are very possible, along with advanced battery storage and pumped hydro, run of the river, non-invasive. This is a great time to be involved in that, which of course we are.
Very exciting, absolutely. And I want to throw in there even nuclear. There's been a lot of research even with small modular reactors, and so there's a lot to be said and what kind of development will and the investment opportunities behind that. Please go ahead.
Yes, there's I don't want to steal Church's line, but the Air Force has announced that Eielson, they're considering a small modular reactor for Eielson Air Force Base outside of Fairbanks, Alaska. There are many locations in the Arctic where, again, with community support and concurrence and involvement, where small modular reactors make sense for industrial projects or for isolated communities or for intensive projects. This is an area where we see lots of opportunity and growth, not just in the United States Arctic, but in our allies and partners as well. Of course, Russia is investing in reactors in their section of the Arctic as well.
Thank you so much, Michael. With that, let's turn a little bit to the geopolitical national security side of things. When we think about the Arctic and cooperation, especially under these climate change based obstacles that continue to emerge along with other broader geopolitical threats. Maybe I'll start with Church, particularly from a DoD standpoint. Are you seeing any capabilities that need to be in place to kind of facilitate cooperation? When we think about competition, that's also increasing because of new trade routes as well, that may become available for longer due to, again, the umbrella of climate change. How do you see that role and the capabilities behind that? And maybe Terza can comment after Church. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you. And Michael, thank you. That's a great set of reflections I would offer to you, sir. Let me just offer a couple of reflections, again, personal view, not Department of Defense vantage point, that ultimately you find a way to reduce tension by having the ability to communicate. Diplomatic discussion is obviously can happen in diplomatic channels, but also among the practitioner community. So, for example, between the United States and Russia, have historically had the ability to de-escalate misunderstandings for incident at sea reporting. There is, of course, the Arctic Coast Guard Forum provides an opportunity, is principally on safety aspects, but ultimately that involves all 8 Arctic nations around the table that can take a look at the safety practices, essentially to be able to reduce the tensions and possibilities for misunderstanding. The Russian Federation and the U.S. Coast Guard, for example, have a waterways management dialogue that allows the U.S. Coast Guard District 17 Commander in Juneau to have a discussion with the Russian border guards, his counterpart there, regarding waterways management, again, to reduce the tension locally in around the Bering Sea. Ultimately, the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, it has 7 of the 8 Arctic nations, plus a number of the European nations. There's a chance to take a look at the defense support, civil authorities for humanitarian assistance, disaster response, and search and rescue activities, again, to make sure that there was interoperability, essentially common practices, and creating essentially a series of opportunities. If something bad happens in the hand of help missions, they're able to have a multinational response. Ultimately, these kind of activities are at the nation state level, but then you also need to add to the level of depth with this by involving local governance, tribal governance in and around the Arctic region, Arctic indigenous leadership, so that you have a richness and essentially, frankly, a more comprehensive response. So I'd offer that as an opportunity, and this is hopefully a good segue for TERS. It offers perhaps some complementary or maybe even contrasting reflections.
Thank you so much, Church. Yeah, just briefly, again, I'm so glad you brought this up. And Michael too, and I'll put my pragmatic hat on here. We don't have enough infrastructure. Remember back at the start of this panel, we said $1 trillion in investment, research, and who knows how much actual development. It sounds like a lot. And if that's going to happen, we don't have the infrastructure, especially in the US Arctic. We depend upon our Russian neighbors right now. If something goes wrong in the Arctic, and it will, there is no certainty. That's such a past term. We can hope for predictability. I will say this, I remember when I was evaluating the search and rescue capabilities of the US Arctic on behalf of Royal Dutch Shell, along with a couple colleagues. And at that time, in the early 2000s, we're standing on the edge of the Arctic Ocean in Inupiat it's summer, maybe it's 2 a.m., maybe it's 2 p.m. Doesn't matter in the summer. It's the same sun, slightly different position. And we see a German cruise ship show up and lighter their cruise ship passengers to the shore on Zodiacs. Now, no one in Inupiat knew they were coming. There is no Coast Guard presence in Inupiat, yet we were going to have a $10 billion oil development operation just off Inupiat, just to the left of Inupiat, just to the west, near Point Lay, Wainwright area. Yet the only search and rescue available to us, should something go wrong, was the people of the region, the North Slope Borough Search and Rescue Crew, which many of my cousins serve on, and fly helicopters. And that's who we have pretty much right now. So I don't want to draw a negative picture, but I wholeheartedly support our focus on infrastructure and I would say, urgent need. We're way behind on supplying the kinds of infrastructure that can handle the development that is rushing towards us, let alone climate change. And I will end with this on this particular note. When we talk about climate change, we talk about solutions for less emissions from the people of the Arctic. I think many of the people who are from the same region I am, it's not so much that we're thinking about our emissions, we're looking for affordable energy. So this is an energy justice issue. The idea that 4 million people in the Arctic are going to make a dent in climate change flips the conversation to a sort of regional responsibility. I guess I would put it like this. It's often the people least responsible for climate change that end up bearing the impacts of climate change. And we need to be cognizant of that when we think about the Arctic and the people who live there.
Thank you so much, Terza. I think you hit the nail on the head, taking all of these factors into consideration. But speaking of cooperation, let me turn a little bit to the Arctic Council and diplomacy. And this is kind of a question for everyone. Um, with Russia now having the chairmanship of the Arctic Council, do you all, would I say, maybe trust what Russia's motives and are at this point in time? Do you think they have the best interests of the High North? And overall, with Arctic states, reconciling their different energy policy priorities to also try to promote cooperation. Are there any other, multinational entities or areas where that could be used maybe to pressure or leverage the countries that are outside the Arctic Council? I mean, I know China always comes to play as a non-Arctic, but how do you see that? And I'll, Terza, if you want to start, and then we can go backwards from there.
Hey, thanks, Julia. Just briefly, because I think we've actually got two really good experts here, and I'm interested in their answer to this question. I'll start again with this. Those are our cousins in Russia. To the region I come from, we were just reunited in the late 80s. The ice wall came up, as we all know, in '89, and shortly thereafter, we were able to rejoin our cousins just 2 miles across. You can see Russia from Alaska, but it's not from Wasilla, it's from Little Diomede. And so we are inexorably connected and have never been separate. So it's a different worldview. So, but to say this, it would be unfortunate if we let the larger nation state politics devolve into an us and them, because again, I'm going to bring it back to the region. The people who will be most deeply impacted by a nuclear sub showing up are the people of the Arctic. And that's not an acceptable risk on so many levels. But I'll leave it to the experts to assess that current risk.
Thank you. Church, do you want to go next?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for those reflections, Terza. I appreciate and certainly can rationalize a lot of thinking in that same perspective. I truly do. I would offer a couple of things that would help, perhaps in this. First of all, when you talk about operational activities of the U.S. military, our allies and partners, and our competitors in the region, there is an aspect. There is a lack of infrastructure, and that's a huge deal. When something bad happens, and it's a matter of when, not a matter of if, do we have the ability to logistically respond, and then also be able to logistically support the responders who are responding themselves? So that's a big challenge. Ultimate infrastructure reduces that delta between the urgency and ability to bring real, definitive capability to reduce the problem, to address whatever the problem is. There are certainly some challenges that could cause you to whistle through your molars and stare at your shoelaces when it comes to such as, like, for example, a cruise ship getting stuck with in an unfortunate situation with a couple thousand people aboard. They ultimately need to be exfilled off that boat into a place where there's no infrastructure. So how do you, in a place, as Terza said, where you can be dead within 12 hours, depending on if the day is a really, really bad day? There's certainly not every day is like that, but certainly plenty that are. So strategically, being able to have operational activities to reduce that are normalized and that people can more familiar and more operationally savvy in the region, I think that matters, as certainly more activities continuing to move to the region, ability to increase the competency is going to matter. So that's at the tactical operational level. More strategically, though, and when you look at the fact of how do we have essentially the policy mechanisms in place that really enable interoperability to be achieved at the operational tactical level? How much do we work at, for example, the Arctic Force Roundtable? There used to be an event called the Northern Chiefs of Defense Forum that has been held in advance now since 2014, where the practitioner community can come together to take a look at the daunting problems where we share essentially the common challenge, and therefore trying to find ways to to identify then field an interoperable response. So I'd offer those as a couple of reflections. I hope that helps. Over.
Michael?
Oh, hey, thank you, Julia, and thank you, Terza and Church. I guess I'll take a slightly different tack. You asked if we can trust that Russia is committed to the Arctic Council. In the words of a former president, I trust that, but I'd also like to verify that. And I think I think Russia is committed to committed to its Arctic development program. As I mentioned earlier, they've almost literally mortgaged the future of their country on developing the oil and gas complexes of the Arctic, and plan to extend that into the hydrogen and petrochemical side as the infrastructure develops and as global markets evolve and change as part of the energy transition. The Arctic Council, the United States is committed to the Arctic Council, as are the other Arctic states. I think one of the potential advantages of the current situation is that we recognize that we also have bilateral Arctic interests with many of our allies and all of our allies and partners in the Arctic. And I think there was a time in the government when people did not want to mention the Arctic in bilateral exchanges because we have the Arctic Council and everything was working fine. I think now there's a recognition that the Arctic interests of our allies and of the United States align to a great extent, and we can build more fruitful bilateral relationships and develop our Arctic expertise, whether it's cross-border information sharing, joint infrastructure development, best practices, deeper scientific cooperation. The Arctic Council efforts will continue, but I think the door is opening to more bilateral Arctic cooperation from the United States than possibly there was in the past, in part because of Russian activity elsewhere.
Thanks, Michael. I couldn't agree more. I too have a kind of a different perspective in the sense of, when you're seeing so much increased activity, military ships and bases being built with Russia, you can't help but to think that it's certainly that competition is certainly growing, and the development certainly goes beyond just sustainability development overall. So a lot to be said there. But at the same time, when we think about scientific cooperation and research activities, there's still quite a bit to embolden and build on partnerships with both Arctic as well as non-Arctic countries, including India, which we tend to forget as well. So they're a big role, especially in the development of renewables going forward. So with that, let me just turn to more on the topic of Indigenous Arctic communities. And I know Terza and Church touched upon this early on, but let me start with Terza. How can you see, basic, I guess, organizations of Indigenous Arctic people continue or try to remain involved? As we hear a lot about not enough representation at the table when it comes to key decisions, but as key stakeholders in particular, and being able to address, it could be geopolitical tensions and resource competition. How do you see them remaining involved, and what could they do to expand upon that?
Well, first, simply, we're there, so we are involved. We are the Arctic, so we can't help but be involved. I guess the formal acknowledgement would be a suggestion. We are participant observers at the Arctic Council. I think that is not enough presence. I'll say that much. I think a stronger role on the Arctic Council, given that we have all of thousands of years of experience in the region of interest. Think of it this way: if somebody came to your neighborhood or your neighborhood from, I don't know, far away. Let's pick a place. The Maririshu Islands, and said, this is exactly how you should run your neighborhood, and this is what we envision for you because we think you need help. How do you think you would react to that? I mean, I know I'm using a ridiculous example, but it is actually not ridiculous. It's exactly how it feels. So I would say that we have some significant leadership, regional leadership, that we could actually model our broader global leadership, or at least regional, non-Indigenous regional leadership after, which is one, the International Circumpolar Council, which my great uncle Evan Hobson is the founder of, but is very strong today and has issued how to work with Inuit peoples in the Arctic 2 months ago. So there are governance structures that can be that you can address, that you can include in place from the indigenous people in the region. I would suggest, as in closing, that the Bering Sea Resilience Network committee that was set up in the Obama administration was an excellent idea and appeared to be working, but it was cut short. I think community-based actions and committees like that, advising our national government, is the path to success.
Thank you. Church, did you have any additional comments about getting more indigenous communities involved?
I would, and I would just give a couple examples. Terza offers some superb reflections. The value of local and place-based knowledge, of course, in any particular region is critical. You know, if your local understanding creates opportunity. Strategically, for me, I would offer that, you know, the Arctic Council provides a great example for the world, frankly. There's 8 Arctic nations and there's 6 recognized indigenous groups under us, actually now organized under Secretariat, that provides essentially an equal seat at the table for the roles and missions that the Arctic Council pursues, principally in that of obviously in collaboration on the Arctic from an environmental vantage point, but also it's somewhat to an economic. There is no security dimension to this at this juncture, but perhaps someday in the future it might. Likely not going to happen. There's probably going to be need for a separate aspect to really take a look at from a multinational security lens in parallel with the Arctic Council, because the Arctic Council specifically stated since its inception to be a non-security based forum. But the indigenous leadership that are equal seats at the table and as nation states, I think is a critical example of where, essentially people who have been there since time began have a powerful voice and a powerful set of perspectives. Lastly, I would share with that's the geostrategic level of influence. There's also where you have local-based practitioners. Terza mentioned earlier about the North Slope boroughs search and rescue, where they have a tremendous search and rescue. I've had the privilege of flying with them as a pilot. I have envied some of the airplanes they have. They're quite remarkable. They're well tailored for the region. And ultimately, they have experts there that know the conditions, how to operate in a way to keep the risk at a pretty low managed level. So there's lessons to be learned from that, where the North Slope governance is actually created a capability that reduces the need for a state or federal level response. There's probably that could be an example used in elsewhere across the Arctic region, where local and place-based knowledge is preeminent and ultimately provides a way to make more cost-effective solutions to reduce the risk that the region endures. So I'd offer those as some perspective, Julie. Over.
Great, thank you so much. And let me just, one final question on that same note, and Terza mentioned this when it came to the resilience in the region and how we define that, but are there any ways that you could see the US trying to prioritize these efforts when it comes to the vulnerability of the people? For example, I mean, I know there's a lot out there with the federal government within the US that's working closely with the Arctic Council, but do you think the engagement is enough? Is there anything more that could be done, especially when it comes to energy security and resilience overall? Is there any recommendations you would give perhaps? And I turn to both Terza and Church if you had a brief comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I do. Thanks for the questions. By the way, great questions. I really do think, and I hope I think I am joined by many in the region in saying that having people of the region at the table is an asset. So it's difficult for me to come from a perspective of asking the vulnerable people to solve their vulnerability, which is kind of how these questions are framed. It is the reverse. It is understand the vulnerability exists because we haven't been invited to the table. We have lots of knowledge and lessons and solutions, just as Church pointed out, our strongest search and rescue capability in the Arctic for the entire United States resides with the Inupiat people of Utqiagvik. Period. Full stop. I'm not saying vulnerable as a category shouldn't exist, but it comes with some connotations that probably should be left in the past. And that is, the solutions exist. If you want to, I'll go back to, if you want to know about ice, go ask an ice expert. Where are they? They're in the Arctic. If you want to know about marine mammals, go ask the preeminent scientists on marine mammals, many of whom are indigenous peoples. They reside in the Arctic. So from research to oil and gas development to policy development, the key to sustainable development, whether it's policy or research or minerals and other resources, is to have the people of the region that are most deeply impacted. I'm going to say it 1,600 times until it sticks, at the table, because your solution will be better. So my whole point there is to incentivize folks out there to make the invitation. Why should it be the vulnerable communities, the people who have not been invited, and keep knocking at the door, making the space for that? It's just, it feels illogical every time I think about it. And that's why I get sort of like, what can I do as an Indigenous person? Nope, that's not how it works. Hope I made sense there, but I think it's probably a valuable premise to start from.
Excellent. Church, any comment?
I would just real quickly, two things to hit on. Number one, I had the privilege of shepherding a Arctic science technology research endeavor for 5.5 years at the University of Alaska, supported by the Department of Homeland Security, oriented on the U.S. Coast Guard. That activity was just, it really gave me a bird's eye view. And I'm not a scientist, although it can kind of be cool to grow up to be one. But the community of Arctic science across the Arctic region is phenomenal. It really, the collaboration, the networks, the partnership, the sharing of knowledge across the community of science in the Arctic, I think is better in the Arctic than anywhere else on the planet. I would also share the value of local-based knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge. I've actually had the time to spend time sitting on the ground in places like Point Barrow, listening to seal hunters explain how things have changed. What was taught to them by their grandfathers is tougher to reconcile today. Water sky still looks like water sky. For those folks who would like to know more about that, we can discuss that later. But the idea of that what used to be safer to go is no longer as easy to predict anymore, simply because of the changes. So this is where the idea of partnership between the community of, for example, geophysical scientists that are understanding what's happening with sea ice and ocean current changes, partnering with folks that have that traditional ecological knowledge in a true partnership approach, as the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee's 5-year plan is really taking a point to try to accomplish. How you do this in a way to advance common understandings and shared knowledge, I think is critical to me, for us to really embark on that, commit to that, and then follow through with that sort of perspective. So hopefully Terza sees it as a good compliment, if you will, fingertip formation in that sort of perspective. And sorry if we're talking like a pilot, but that's kind of the stock and trade I spend most of my life doing. Julie, back to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Church. I'm now looking at some of the Q&As from the audience. Let me turn to Michael on this one. When we think about energy security and the Arctic Council, what do you see as some of the foundational components of energy diplomacy in the region? And at a high level with the Council, are there any written agreements governing oil and gas extraction activities in the region? Are there any key provisions that you could talk about?
Great question. I'm racking my brain. I saw the question. To my knowledge, the only agreements governing oil and gas extraction besides national laws are commercial contracts where they are in place. There is no pan-Arctic legally binding oil and gas agreement. Then the question became, the rest of the question on energy resilience within the oil and gas sector. I think that going forward, and kind of piggybacking on the last question where Church was saying, we are talking about changing communities. The fuel logistics infrastructure network in the Arctic is changing for the first time in maybe 60, 70 years. The traditional the traditional diesel fuel oil based logistics system where you pick up your barge or your plane load of fuel, you have your generator and it goes, that is changing, and will continue to change. And going back to what Terza said, just accepting it and saying, well, the market's changed and we don't sell that anymore. And here's your new generator, here's your new logistic network. That's not going to work. So getting to communities and peoples early and working with them to find the new logistics network, the new energy sources that work from their needs, including both power output, resiliency, being available, and training and cost. Of course, the main thing, people in the Arctic, we don't talk about it enough. We haven't talked about now. People in the Arctic pay way too much to stay alive. That is fundamentally. So I think the question was asked earlier, what is your definition of when energy security would be achieved? When communities, by their own assessment, feel like they are paying a fair price for an adequate amount of power with adequate reserves in case of disaster. And we're not there yet. I mean, the United States isn't there yet. I don't think most of our Arctic partners are there yet, but it's a place we want to get to. And it sounds like I'm marching off to the side, but it all ties together. These logistic networks are changing because of the global energy transition, which in itself is a movement away from oil and gas in transportation to more renewable, more climate-friendly sources. And that doesn't mean oil and gas are going away. Russia again has bet the country, and I think their ambition would probably be to sell the last barrel of oil that ever goes into the back of a car or a ship or an airplane. But extraction for petrochemicals and such will continue for a very long time, I'm sure. But commercial use, residential use is changing rapidly. It's changing in the lower 48, it's changing around the world. That change is coming to the Arctic. We're trying to get ahead of it. And that can help communities with resilience. But if communities get left behind, they will be the last, and they will be in a bad place if we're not proactive. Don't like that word, but if we're not proactive about helping them decide what's in their best interest. Thanks. I hope that answered some of the question.
Yes, thank you so much. We've got like a minute left. I want to just quickly turn to church. This is a question also from the audience, but also a topic that's near and dear to me as I worked these issues in the White House last year with trying to increase our icebreaker fleet and U.S. investment opportunities. So I just want to quickly turn. We have 2 icebreakers currently right now for the Arctic, and one is at least over 50 years old. Washington has certainly underestimated some of these investments and other essential materials. Do you see anything changing? Do you see at some point, I know the Hill has allocated some funding to increase our icebreaker fleet, but love to get your quick 1-minute final response on that role in U.S. investment overall.
Well, strategically, icebreakers provide persistent presence in a way that's not met by anything else in the maritime region. Remember, the Arctic is a maritime region, and icebreaking provides you year-round access to be able to go in the region. Now, of course, as you look to the future, well, we have diminishing ice. Should we have need for less icebreakers? I said, no, that would not be the case. You need icebreaking to be able to project year-round presence, and when it's in your time and choosing. There's 6 authorized right now for replacing the U.S. icebreaking fleet for the U.S. Coast Guard. We're modernizing it. Right now, we have appropriations for less than that number. We need to establish the number the U.S. Coast Guard said they need to have is 6. I do believe that we need to fund all 6 in order to create that capability. And people worry a little bit about the Russian Federation's vast number of icebreakers. Remember, they use a lot of icebreaking, not just for sovereign presence, but they also use it for logistics support to their northern communities because they don't have the other way to get the products to those communities. So strategically, we need more icebreakers. The number was 6. We need appropriations for all 6. That's a personal reflection, not one that was associated with the Department of Defense. Back to you, Madam.
Thank you,
Julie. I'd like to jump in and strongly associate myself with that. Also, keeping in mind that our icebreakers are supporting polar presence at both ends of the globe. And an icebreaker in Antarctica is one that is not in Alaska. From a renewable energy point of view, again, these massive investments we're planning to make in the development of the Port of Nome, that requires continuous access and And more investment means more icebreakers, not less, regardless of the change in the climate, as Church said. But I can't emphasize enough. I just had to stop it.
No, thank you, Michael. And unfortunately, we've run short of time here. So I know we could probably take some of this offline or have a continuation of discussion for a future event with the Atlantic Council. So thank you all so much for joining for this important conversation, and many thanks to Ambassador Elosdoris for joining. General Key Church, thank you so much for your insightful words, and good luck to you at the Ted Stevens Center. We're all rooting for you. Michael, thank you again for your insights and representing the Arctic Energy Office. We're going to stay tuned to some of these updates that you teased us on a little bit here. And Terza, oh my goodness, thank you so much for really opening our eyes to the broader picture when it comes to resilience, the Indigenous communities, and looking at the energy transition overall and the importance of that interconnectedness behind that. So I thank you all for each of your perspectives on that. There's no doubt we need to deal with the consequences with the changing climate. There's the patterns are certainly developing. We need to look also to the long term for what investments are being made to address these long-term consequences. So if anyone would like to rewatch the panel or share the stream with a colleague, you can find a recording on the Atlantic Council website as well as YouTube channel. So again, thanks for joining us, and hope everyone has a great rest of your day. God bless.
Thank you.